Excellent. Well, I think we are ready to get started. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm Rebecca Honig. I'm the Director of Content and Curriculum for Ready for K. In my role, I build our curriculums at each age level, and I write our messages along with an amazing team, some of whom are on this call with us today, where we're going to focus on how to get family feedback from afar, a topic I know is extremely timely and one we're really eager to dive into. I'm joined by my colleague Maya Sussman over there in the corner. She's our Director of Product. We're also joined by David Adler, a career school practitioner and data-informed leadership consultant, who is also the husband of our very own Ready for K teammate, Mary Westervelt, which is why they're together in the same room. David will share a little more about his background later on. So on this webinar today, we're going to explore strategies for composing survey questions that help ensure that you get the parental input you need to make decisions and best support your families this year and into the future. I myself got a little input after my last webinar that I am attempting to implement right now. My 7-year-old peeked in as I was presenting, and then afterward he said to me, "Mom, when you talk about your work, you get really excited, but it makes your face start to look a little bit creepy. So maybe you could put your excited feelings someplace else, like into your feet maybe, where people can't see." So I'm working on that right now. You can let me know how I did after this webinar. Today, our goals are to explore 6 rules for useful surveys, lessons we've learned from Ready for K surveys, and how you might leverage those lessons in your own work with families, and how to use rapid response text surveys to get immediate input on your most burning questions. If you're a note taker, you can feel free to just sit back and listen. We'll actually be posting this webinar to all of our feeds. So if you take a quick moment to follow us right now, you'll have access to that. Also, I just wanted to note we'll be answering your questions at the end, but you can feel free to enter them into the Q&A feature down there in the corner along the way as they occur to you. So I know we are all eager to get to the heart of today's topic. Before we jump in, I want to very quickly orient you around Ready for K so that those of you who aren't familiar with our program can have a little bit of context as we move forward. Ready for K is an evidence-based family engagement curriculum delivered via text message that gives families the tools and information they need to support their child's learning. We reach parents year-round, 3 times a week, starting our support at birth and continuing all the way through 4th grade. And it's available in multiple languages, English, Spanish, Arabic, and we're growing our list every day. On Mondays, we send a fact message with information on a specific skill and why it's important to their child's development. And the purpose of this message is to close information gaps and orient families around their children's learning and development. For example, fact, kids are excited to learn all about themselves. The more they learn about themselves, the more confidence they have to thrive in school. We follow that on Wednesday with a tip message. The tip message offers an activity that's mapped right onto a family's daily routine that builds the skill of the week. And our tip messages are designed to activate families by offering one easy thing they can do to support their child's learning in a very explicit skill area. So tip. In the morning, look in the mirror together. Take turns naming your child's positive qualities. You have brown eyes, you are kind, you are strong. So that tip always builds directly off of the fact message. And then on Friday, we send a growth message. Our growth messages offer a little bit of encouragement and one way to take that skill even further. Here is the example in front of us. Growth, keep helping your child learn about themselves. As you look in the mirror, share things about your family, like where you live and your traditions. So we have several versions of the Ready for K program. We have Ready for K Core, which offers a whole child curriculum focusing on math, literacy, and social and emotional skills. It's aligned with the learning standards of all 50 states, as well as the Head Start Early Learning Outcomes Framework. We recently, just 6 weeks ago, launched our Ready for K Trauma Informed program, which has been in development for several years and was informed by mental health experts, visiting nurses and families who have lived through adverse experiences. Its purpose is to provide messaging that helps families buffer the effects of trauma, and it's aligned to the Strengthening Families Protective Factors framework. And then our last program is Ready for K, personalized learning, which actually creates a individualized version of our program for each child who joins. It's based on children's ages and stages screener results. So we message along communication, personal, social, gross motor, fine motor, and problem solving skills at the child's developmental level for each one of those skills. So we're really supporting kids exactly where they're at within each of those domains. And the Ready for K approach works. It's proven through numerous RTC studies to increase parental engagement and leads to up to 2 to 3 months of child learning gains. We integrate feedback into the very fabric of Ready for K, surveying parents 4 times a year and then using that information to better serve families. And in our most recent survey, we learned that 94% of families do a Ready for K activity at least once a week with their child. And we attribute this in part to the fact that at every phase of development, we have integrated parental feedback into our program, from its design and its formula to its dosage and its curricular coverage. We survey families, we talk with families about their strengths, their needs, their goals, and we really design our programs to support those needs and goals. Our trauma-informed program, for example, was informed by listening sessions that we hosted across the country. So parental feedback and asking questions to get at the heart of what we want to know in order to make Ready for K better for families is really core to our mission. And it's something that we are very excited to dive into with you today. So let's jump right in. David, I'm going to pass the mic to you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I had to unmute. And thank you, Rebecca. So it's a pleasure to join you guys today. I was asked to participate in this webinar because I've been using data to make real, very difficult decisions for years in schools. To give you a little background about me, I studied math at Carnegie Mellon in the 90s. And after I graduated, I watched my friends take jobs at places like Microsoft and Goldman Sachs. And those choices really didn't speak to me. So while I knew I didn't really want to be a banker or a tech guy, I wasn't sure what I did want to do with that math background. So I thought, well, I do need to make money. So to make a little bit of money, I started subbing as a math teacher. And I immediately fell in love with that profession. So much to everyone's surprise, I went and got a master's degree in education and dove into a teaching career. As time went by, I moved into administration. And that's when my background in complex math actually became incredibly helpful. A lot of folks don't really know that advanced math is really all about creative thinking, but you're using numbers instead of what most administrators are using, words and stories and anecdotes. So when I became the principal of a chronically underperforming charter school, I really had to figure out how to use the data that I had, but it came to me often incomplete and pre-analyzed. And I had to use that to make the decisions that leveraged the resources we had, which weren't too many, and got the buy-in from my staff and families, and result in significant improvements in test scores and the other outcome measures I was monitoring. So if that sounds like a familiar challenge to you, then you know why all my friends in administration started reaching out to me for help. So to fast forward, I've dedicated the last decade or so of my professional career helping school leaders at that intersection of data and hard decision making. And today I'll share with you how you can get the data you really need to make the decisions that you're facing today. So here's the most important thing you need to know. The purpose of the data is to help you, the leaders, to help kids, to help families, to help your community. When you start thinking about all the possible data, which is just a sciencey word for information that you might need, it distracts you from the data or information that you really do need. So if you take only one thing away from today's talk about how to get high quality family feedback, this is what it should be. Just focus on the information you need to make the decision that's in front of you right now. And if you do that, you'll be getting the right information, you're going to use it, your families will appreciate it, and the family feedback system that you establish is going to work for you. So most of what I'm going to share with you today is about surveying, and it has a caveat. And it's important to know that the 6 rules we're going to talk about today are for in-house surveys only. You should never modify a survey that comes with a product or one that's been research validated. However, if you get something like a list of 45 recommended survey questions for all schools, or if you're generating your own surveys, please don't send out a massive survey to your families or worry about, I have to send all 45 of those questions. You can modify them, you can change them, and we're going to talk about how and why. So here's rule number 1. And often school leaders are issuing surveys because you need to know. But remember that you only really need the data that's going to help you to make the decision that's in front of you. So before you're asking your parents to spend their valuable time on your survey, make sure your team know first, what do you need to know? Are you making decisions about your scheduling, about technology, about your food distribution program? And what's the information that you're going to need to help you to make that decision? The second thing is, why do you want to know it? What's the decision that you're going to make based on this information? If there's no actionable outcome from the information, don't ask the question. Now is not the time for you to be asking for information you can't use or that you're not going to use. And last, how are you going to use it? That's a little bit different from the why. You need to take the time to think about this information and how it's going to actually impact your decision. We've all been asked to take surveys and answer questions that seem like box-checking exercises. But if family input is not going to change your decision, or if you don't know how it can be used, don't ask the questions. So make sure you're clear with your surveys. What do you want to know and why do you want to know it? What are you going to do with the information? And how is it going to impact survey? In short, if the results are not going to lead to specific, transparent decision-making, you may want to reconsider issuing the survey at all. So this brings us to rule number 2. And this year, parents are playing a key role in implementation of curriculum and instruction, more so than they ever have before. And it's a totally different model. So if you're going to need to survey them more frequently than you ever imagined, making sure to keep everyone aligned and ensure your program's actually working. So how do you keep those families engaged? Well, one of the ways is by keeping your surveys and input requests low lift and high reward. And that means keeping it short. The longer and more frequent surveys are, the more people will grow weary of them. If you create an expectation that the surveys you share are going to be easy to fill out, families are more likely to keep responding to them. And there's a few ways to do this. First, as a general principle for family input surveys, I prefer to keep it to no more than 5 questions. But if I can get away with cutting it down to 2 or 3, that's even better. Now, some of you who are sitting there with research backgrounds, this may be violating every principle of rigor that you stand for. But you have to remember that these are not academic surveys. These are dipsticks into your community's opinions about the real issues they're currently facing. And validity is really important. But in non-academic environments, maybe we should be willing to sacrifice some of the rigor for the sake of increasing our response rates. The second thing you should do is take the survey yourself and time it. People have a tendency to stop paying attention to surveys as they progress. So if your survey is taking longer than about 5 minutes, maybe you should consider cutting it down. And here's an example. This is a great way to look at questions by asking yourself, what do I really need to know? And what's the best way to ask that question? With a little reflection, you can pare down your question to the few highest value questions you really need answers. And this is a great way to do it, is maybe you can combine some questions together to give one single question. Now this brings us to our next rule. This seems like a really ridiculous rule, but it's a super important one. And it's the most common mistake that amateur survey designers are going to make. So I'll give you an example. I worked with an administrator who wanted to make a move towards a restorative justice program in their school. They decided that they were going to survey parents to support the assumption that parents would prefer restorative justice to a punitive disciplinary system like detentions or suspensions. So they asked the question on the survey, how do you feel about detention? And what they learned is that everybody hates detention. Nobody wants their kids getting detention. This is an intuitive result. But they still didn't know whether parents would actually support a new approach like restorative justice. So when they implemented the new policy, all the families were confused and felt like they hadn't had a chance to give input. And that's exactly the situation that the administrator was hoping to avoid. So before you send out a question, think about those what, why, how questions in rule number 2, and make sure that the question you're asking will give you the information that you actually need. And the best way to do that is to be specific in asking the questions and avoiding vague language. So let's look at an example of this. In our example here, the school recently changed the 3rd grade social studies curriculum, and they changed the Explorers unit to add some more information about Christopher Columbus and his role in colonization and impact on indigenous communities. What they want to know is whether families are satisfied with the new content. Is this a pretty controversial issue, but a timely and important one? So the first example question assumes that families know what the changes were, and it doesn't ask about the actual part of the curriculum that the team changed. This question would almost certainly get data that's not really useful. The second example is better because it highlights the unit that's under discussion, but it still assumes that families have a lot of background knowledge about the curriculum. It also asks how they feel and is open-ended, and those questions are kind of hard to synthesize. The last, whoops, sorry about that, there we go. So this last example is giving the most useful data because it focuses respondents' attention on the issue that's at hand, and it's calling for responses to that line of inquiry that the administrator actually has. It's also using a Likert scale, which we'll get into a little bit later, which makes for easier interpretation and analysis of the data. And you can then follow it up with another question like, please elaborate, or can you explain why, that will actually allow you to unpack people's feelings, especially when those feelings are strong. So this brings us to rule number 4 about variables. The question type, or the variable that you choose, should reflect how you're going to use that information. So don't select the type of question until you know what kind of information you're going to need. There's a really simple example here that you could use when you're planning your COVID has ended pizza party. So the 4 question types that you could be using here, first, a multiple choice or binary type question, where you're trying to get a vote or a ranking in terms of what's the most popular choice. So this can be helpful if you want to know those rankings or get a voice vote on a specific set of options. For example, if you're choosing how much of each type of pizza, you could give a set of choices: pepperoni, olive, plain, whatever. A second way to do this is to use a Likert scale. And this is when you're trying to get a sense of preference and comparing phenomena. So this can be helpful if you want to figure out how strongly people feel about something. For example, maybe you want to know how many people are actually going to show up, so you don't overorder the pizza. If everyone's definitely going to be there, order more pizza. If lots of people are only a maybe, then maybe you could dial back the order. That leads us to a continuous variable where people are entering in numbers. And this helps you to lay out your data on a distribution. So if you want the analysis to give you answers like 80% of our attendees anticipate eating 3 slices of pizza or fewer, you can use a continuous variable. And last is the open response type questions where you're really trying to capture stories. And this is helpful if you want to capture those stories or specific quotes or anecdotes. And this can help you plan events. For example, you could say, what kind of activities would you like to see at the party? And really leave it wide open so that you can get lots of feedback and maybe people are thinking a little differently than you are. So here's an example. Let's say you want to know how much combined classwork and homework students are doing every day. So if you want a general sense, you could use that binary question where you ask people, are they doing 0 to 2 hours, 2 to 4 hours, 4 to 6, or 6 or more? But if you want to have maybe parents' opinions about schoolwork, then you can use a Likert scale here. And this is just 3 choices, but you can expand it to any number. Some Likert scales are up to 10. But if you want to know a full distribution of the schoolwork load, then you could choose a continuous variable where you could really have all of the students, and you can have the specific numbers, and you can actually plot a distribution on a graph, which gives you the most fine-grained information, but can also be a little bit too specific and maybe people don't know. So weighing the choices here of how you want to control the information, how you want to think about the information, and how you want to display the information is really going to drive what you choose. This brings us to rule number 5. And this is one of the most powerful and often overlooked aspects of surveying, is that you can use it to plot those changes over time. And this can be simple and amazingly powerful with surveys of any length, even just one question. The key is that you continue to ask the same question or similar questions as possible every time. So this could give you comparisons like maybe in September, 78% of your parents were happy or very happy, with the balance you have between synchronous and asynchronous class time. But by November, it fell to 35%. This can really help you to plot changes over time in people's attitudes, in what people are doing, in their behaviors. So when you're writing questions, consider that they should be timeless and try to avoid overly specific or time-keyed language. Try to make sure that the question is working in a wide variety of circumstances. And here's an example. In this example, we see a question that someone might write because it's exactly what she wants to know in the moment. It's a great example of rule number 2, knowing the why. But this question can't really be reused. So 2 simple changes, one of them generalizing the tech reference, and the second is generalizing the time, could make a world of difference and allow data from this question to show changes over time. So for example, we could see that fewer students need tech resources, they need tech help, they need tech during breaks, or maybe more students are using their tech over the vacation over time, and that would be really good information to have. And this is the last rule. Show families their impact, and this is perhaps the most important one. When you take a survey, even if it's a short one, it's a chore. And even your most engaged families are going to grow weary of taking surveys. So a way for you to combat this is to ensure that you are transparent, not only in your intent to use the data, but actually when the data has informed your decision making. So make sure that people know you've listened to them and their involvement has actually guided your actions. So when you announce a program change, reference the data. Just hearing, we decided to add 2 new lunch distribution centers based on feedback from the last family survey will help families feel like they're an important part of that process. It's by creating a positive feedback loop. You ask for input, you use the input, they see how their input made a difference. Then they're going to be more likely to participate in your surveys over time. A further aspect of this rule is to make sure that you're making every effort to include all voices in your community. A big problem in the validity of survey data is what's called response bias, meaning that the data is not often reflective of your entire population. It's important to remember that a lack of participation isn't a reflection of disinterest. It can be a lack of time, barriers like language or literacy. It can be a belief that input just won't make a difference. So a few ways to improve response rates are, first of all, just translate your survey. If you have commonly spoken languages that you serve, make sure your questions are in those languages too. And this has the added benefit of signaling to those families that speak other languages that you want and value their feedback. Another strategy could be leveling your text, both in the survey and in the request for feedback. In fact, leveling all of your parent messages will help you build that positive feedback loop. A third is that you could enlist your staff, specifically ELL staff, exceptional children's specialists, anyone who's dealing with increasingly marginalized communities. They should never imply in any way that the services are in any way linked to participation, but these interactions are great opportunities to build trust around feedback surveys and share how communication in your organization is a two-way street. And last, maybe you can leverage community groups for assistance. There are organizations that interact with families and have the trust of families. That could be a great way to improve response rates. I really wish I could offer you a silver bullet to ensure full representation. The reality is that full representation on any single survey, let alone all of them, is practically impossible. Your best strategy is to have a plan for inclusion and to be vigilant. If you can, try to evaluate responses through use of demographic questions so you can figure out who is responding and how that's reflective of your population as a whole. And you can track the success of your efforts and make any necessary changes. So show families that you're using the data, and this will create an understanding that your family input matters and build a culture of continuous feedback that you're looking for. So those are my 6 rules, and I want to thank Ready for K for the opportunity to share these simple strategies and for you for coming and listening. I'm always happy to talk about education data, so feel free to contact me if you want to delve any deeper. With that, I'll toss it back to Maya.
Thank you so much, David. So as Rebecca mentioned at the start of this presentation, parent feedback has been a core part of the evolution of Ready for K from the very start. So in the early days, we used to use pen and paper surveys to get feedback from families. But we found that paper surveys are hard to scale. And as you've all probably experienced firsthand, particularly challenging when you're not interacting with families in person. Can we go to the next slide, please? So at one point we experimented with sending parents a link to fill out a survey online. That's the next slide. So they'd get the link to the survey in a text message, and when they clicked it, it would take them to a website to complete the survey. And it made it really easy for us to survey lots of families all at once, but we weren't particularly satisfied with the response rates we were getting here. So eventually we switched to sending the survey question right in the text message itself. We sent the exact same question that we had been using in the online survey. And overnight, we saw our response rate increase by a factor of 10. So parents were 10 times more likely to respond to this in-text version of the survey than the online version. So we built on that success, and now as part of Ready for K, we automatically survey parents in text 4 times a year. And we ask multiple choice questions to gather quantitative insights on parents' experience with the program. So for example, what you see here, how often do you do Ready for K activities with your child? The options might be more than 3 times a week, 2 to 3 times a week, once a week, not at all. And then we follow up with open response questions to get more qualitative feedback, like what was your favorite Ready for K activity? Or how can we make the program even more helpful for your family? And we share these survey results with our partners, but we also use the responses to continuously improve our program. For example, we heard over and over from parents who completed our survey that they wanted to be able to receive texts for more than 1 child. So in the past year, we launched a solution that allows parents to receive texts for up to 3 children. And we also heard feedback from our partners who wanted to be able to send their own in-text surveys out to families. So we recently launched a survey feature in the Ready for K dashboard. And I'm going to walk you through how that works and share some examples of how Head Start, schools, and other organizations are using this tool to get family feedback and answer some of these burning questions we've been talking about. So as a Ready for K partner, you get access to a dashboard, which you can see here, where you can enroll all your families with just a few clicks. You can view your live enrollment and engagement data, and you can also send your own custom messages and surveys. Now we've designed the survey feature to make it as quick and easy as possible for you to ask a question and get responses from families. It only takes a minute to send out a survey, and then we aggregate the responses for you, so you can spend your time acting on the insights you get. When you send a survey, you can filter recipients by grade level, age, zip code, any other data that you've included when you added your parents. And if you serve families who speak multiple languages, you'll be able to compose your survey in each language. So in each text box, you can see the number of parents who will receive the message in that language, as well as the number of characters you have left in your message. So when you send a survey, you'll compose your question in these boxes on the left, keeping in mind all the great recommendations that David shared about crafting effective questions. And then you'll type each of the possible answers over on the right side. And we recommend including 4 possible answers because that tends to give you the best insights. So if you include an odd number of choices, for example, always, sometimes, never, people tend to choose the middle option because it's the least commitment. It doesn't really require them to take a stance. Most of you on this webinar would probably choose the middle answer in this example. But including 4 options, say always, most of the time, once in a while, never, that really forces people to choose a more specific answer. But in our tool, you can also send questions with just 2 possible answers. For example, if you just want to ask a yes or no question. So once you've composed your question and answers in each language, you can choose to either send the survey out right away, or you can schedule it for some time in the future. So if you schedule it for later, you'll choose a date and time for your survey to go out. Otherwise, it'll go out as soon as you hit send. And we set you up with a separate phone number for any surveys or custom messages you send. So parents receive Ready for K messages from one number on the left here, and your surveys and messages from another on the right. So this means you don't have to worry about parents getting too many texts since they're going out from 2 separate messaging streams. And your survey goes out in text, so parents don't need to click a link or anything in order to respond. They just type their answer into a text message and hit send. So once your survey goes out, you'll see it show up in the dashboard under sent messages, and then our system automatically collects and aggregates the replies for you. So survey responses are collected for a week after your survey goes out, And you can see here how long your survey will be active right there in the yellow box. You'll see families' responses show up over on the right as soon as they come in, and they'll continue to update throughout the week. Now, David mentioned a great strategy for sharing the results of your surveys back to families so that they know how important their responses were in influencing your decisions. So once your survey is done, you could come back to the same page and send out a custom message to share the results with your families. So I wanted to end by just sharing some examples of survey questions that our partners have been sending recently to leave you with some inspiration for questions you might want to ask your families. So I know that Head Starts and many schools and other organizations are doing community assessments and self-assessments this time of year, and they're wanting to incorporate parent input into those. So we're seeing some partners use this survey tool as a way to get data on family needs when they're not able to check in with them in person. For example, here's a question a partner sent to understand families' needs when it comes to food. We're also seeing partners send surveys to try to understand how COVID has affected their families. So one of our partners asked about the financial impact of COVID, and they learned that their families had been heavily affected and that their Spanish-speaking families in particular had suffered from illness. And finally, we're seeing partners use surveys to gauge parents' comfort with sending their kids back to school. So one of our partners recently asked about this and learned that families' comfort in sending their kids back to school was pretty mixed. There were roughly even numbers of parents who responded with each of these answer options. So those are some examples of how partners have been using this tool to get family feedback. And all of these questions are really great examples of questions you might ask over time, as David discussed, because families' needs and attitudes are changing really quickly. What they need, how they feel right now might be very different from what's going on come October. So before we open it up to your questions, we want to take a moment to let you know about the grant program that we've recently made available. We recognize this is a particularly important time to activate parents as at-home education partners. So we worked hard to come up with the most generous equity-based grant program we could, because we want as many families as possible to have the support they need right now. So if you'd like to talk to us about your organization's needs for at-home learning support, we encourage you to complete the online application. And with that, I will turn it over to Mary to facilitate your questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. So one of the first questions that I see here is interest in knowing more about the process in sending texts for more than one child. So Maya, could you tell the story of the family feedback that we got, the partner feedback that we got, and how you solved that? And I want to highlight that Maya is a very creative product director and did a great job.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is, I think, an example of where we heard one thing in our survey responses, but the solution we came up with wasn't exactly what everyone was asking for. So what we kept hearing was, we send these text messages 3 times a week, and we heard, I want to get them for each of my child. Can I sign up and get the 3 texts for each of my children? And we initially experimented with that, and what we found was it was too many texts. Parents were opting out. They were tuning out. We signed up for them ourselves, and we couldn't keep track of it. It was just like, 9 texts a week is way too much. So we took a step back and thought, well, what is the actual need that we're hearing here? It's receiving Ready for K-like support for all my children. It's not literally receiving the same program for all my children. And so what we ended up doing is sort of consolidating the messages so that it was easier for families to keep track of which messages were for each child, and so that they didn't receive so many. So the current solution is that if you sign up for 3 children, on Monday you'll receive your fact tip growth for 1 child. On Wednesday you'll receive fact tip growth for the 2nd. And on Friday you'll receive fact tip growth for the 3rd. So it's still 3 text messages a week, but it's supporting all 3 children. And I will say this is a solution that's continuing to evolve. So it's been out there for about 6 months now, and we're continuing to gather feedback on it. So likely it will be changing more in the future based on what we hear.
Thank you. So the next question that I have is about balancing in-house data collection with parents and families for decisions that need to be made now versus data collection and surveys for research or evaluation purposes. And how do you balance those things? So David, I think that's probably a question for you.
Sure. It's a great question. You know, I mean, when you're doing program evaluation, you're doing research, you typically have a survey that you've pre-established. You have the questions that you want to ask, and you also have a calendar. And you should have that set. You should figure out what it is you want to know, how you want to do it, when you want to do it, what the calendar is. And then look at when you're going to be able to get that data and that feedback. And then you can fill in the information that you're going to need, either things that are not being asked about, or things that are, you know, there's too long of a time span in between instruments. And so there's nothing wrong with reusing questions from a survey. So if you have, for example, you're giving a survey 3 times a year, every 4 months as a result of your research evaluation, you could maybe perhaps give a question from that survey or 2 or 3 questions every month. And you could get more information and track it longitudinally. Now those in-house surveys where you're reusing some of those questions won't be usable for the research and evaluation program, but they will be helpful to you if you're tracking over time or looking at those things. So what I would say is, you know, try to make sure that you can use as much as you can, use things for multiple purposes, and then fill in where you need to.
Thank you. Maya, I'm seeing a question about how often do you recommend people send out a survey using the program that you shared?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it comes back to your needs, as David discussed. So what is the question you need to answer right now, and how time sensitive is that? So we at Ready for K, we survey families quarterly. And our questions, I'll say, are not as time sensitive as yours may be. So we're really trying to get a gauge on how parents are responding to the program. And that doesn't need to happen, you know, every week. It can happen once a quarter. And we've found that to be a good cadence as far as getting high response rates. For surveys that our partners send out, so we collect responses for each survey for a week. So I would definitely recommend waiting at least a week till you send your next question. The partners who've used it so far, I would say, have waited anywhere from a couple weeks to a month or 2 between questions, and just to give themselves time to, you know, make sense of the data, make the decision they needed to make, share back responses with parents, and then move on to the next question.
Thank you. I also have a question here. Somebody would like more information about the evidence basis of the Ready for K program. Maya, I know you are probably as well versed as anybody in sharing kind of the history of how the evidence led to the program. Can you give a quick summary of that?
Yeah, so Ready for K came out of research that the founder, Ben York, did while he was at Stanford University, before it was even a product out in the world. And so he and his team did a couple randomized control trials early on. The first one was in San Francisco Unified School District, where in the early learning department. And so they randomly distributed parents across different versions of the program. So some parents received Ready for K, similar to what it's like today, and some parents received a control, so just a text message about school reminders and updates every month or so. And what they found is the parents who received Ready for K were more involved at home and at school. And this came from parent surveys, also from surveying teachers who didn't know which parents were in which group. And they found that their kids were 2 to 3 months ahead in literacy gains across the school year. So this was looking at literacy assessments that they were doing at the district. So building on that success, there have been a bunch of other randomized controlled trials. Another one focused on a personalized version of the program, which is what led to our personalized learning product. And we have ongoing research happening as we speak with researchers at Notre Dame and Brown right now in districts and organizations across the country.
Thank you. We have somebody who asked how to get in touch with David, so I'm just going to scroll back, if you bear with me for a moment, so that people can see his email address is here. So if anybody wants to contact him, that's the best way to do it. Rebecca, there's some interest in knowing about the work that you have done with family listening sessions.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about how those were put together as another way to reach families?
Absolutely. So what we did is in any situation where we're going in to learn more about a community's unique needs, we want to bring those community stakeholders to the table. And we want to hear from community members to learn more about the population in order to define who needs to be at that table. So we usually have kind of a multi-tiered system where first we will meet with a community partner. They bring on a set of advisors that includes oftentimes people they would identify as more academics, and then practitioners who are really with families, working with them day in and day out. Those practitioners are usually the ones who help us identify families, who really give us a nice sampling of the community. We want to make sure that all voices are represented. And then we work with those key stakeholders to define a set of core questions that we're going to ask the community. Knowing, of course, that when we get in the room, new topics and conversations will emerge, but we do have a guiding set of questions. And usually our goal is to both identify pain points and needs, but also strengths, because that's really, that intersection is where our content really lives, is in not only addressing families' needs, but also using their own strengths and the assets that are unique to that community to really leverage families as their first and as children's first and most important teachers. So there's a lot of back and forth. Our listening sessions have historically gone on way longer than we scheduled for. We did one with the New York City Department of Education Parent Policy Council, and I think we had an hour and a half scheduled, and families just stuck around for 3 hours, and it was really a stunning conversation in which needs were surfaced that really came from that group conversation. So then we create really a loop where we present back to families what we heard, so that they can comment on our understandings and make any corrections or add additional context. Once we've had that back and forth, we begin crafting messages. And we usually include that core group of families and practitioners in several review cycles. So looking at the outline and looking at draft one and continuing to offer feedback as we get farther along in the development process.
Thank you. So I'm going to give it another minute. We've answered most of the questions that folks have posed here. If you do have any other questions, then feel free to post them. There's a question about, so the person who is interested in balancing the question of in-house data versus data for research. David answered that a little earlier, but maybe you can take a moment to quickly synthesize some of your thoughts there.
Sure. I think the long and short of it is that program evaluation happens with preset surveys and on a calendar. And I think that information can double, it can serve two purposes. One is the purpose for the program evaluation, but the second purpose is you can actually use that data to help you to make decisions. And so what I would do is actually look at the surveys, look at the calendar, look at the questions, and anticipate what information am I going to be getting from that and on what calendar. And then use that to help me then drive the calendar of what are the additional surveys and additional questions I would want to use. I think the other piece of that is that I would also look at how can I maybe tune some of the questions that I wanted to ask to make them similar so that I can maybe fill in some of the gaps and make them more longitudinal, like that rule that we put in before. I would never use the in-house generated survey questions or the data from that to augment the evaluation. I would never add it to that data. But I think if we were looking at using it for internal decision making, I think that's a great way to step into that and really fill in what tend to be large gaps. Most program evaluation takes place over long periods of time, so it may not be as actionable as you want it to be.
There was a question about us sharing the content today, and as Rebecca mentioned, we will be posting on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And so we will follow up shortly through those venues, so you'll be able to access the presentation that way. And we will also, as always, be posting all of the resources on our blog so that you can come back and find it there too. And we had a question about contacting us, about some of the things that we have talked about. You can email info@readyfork.com, or you can access our homepage, readyfork.com, and that will direct you to some of the information we shared today.
I wanted to share a sort of a personal anecdote, and I'd love your thoughts on it. We have 3 children. We recently received a survey via email from our district, and it was multiple choice, and there was an other section after each multiple choice question. And as I was filling it out, you know, my husband also filled it out on his computer, and he asked me, how did it go? And I said, well, I skipped over a lot of the multiple choices because I didn't see my answers in there, so I just filled in the other section. And he was like, you didn't really take the survey then, Rebecca. And I'm wondering if this is a common sort of conundrum with offering the other, and if there's also opportunities, if that is a common occurrence, to take what is learned in the other section to do round 2 of multiple choice. What was surfacing for me is that I was being asked about my concerns, and I just wasn't seeing them in the drop down, you know, in the choices. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that sort of nuance there.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. So I mean, if you have an other button that is only an other button, and you see that as one of the top responses, you know that what you have anticipated and how you understand your issue is not how your families understand that issue. You're not attuned to their needs. And then maybe you need to do more listening. Maybe you need to go out into your community. Maybe you need to figure it out because you clearly don't have the best handle on it. A lot of times people will have an other as an other, please specify, and give people a little text window. And that can help you to do the research as well to figure out, you know, when people say other, what do they mean? And that can do some of that work. But I totally agree with you. I think that's the right interpretation is, you know, when you have a lot of people saying other all of the time, it means that maybe you don't quite understand this issue the way that your family is understanding. You're not as aligned as you think you are. And that can be a serious problem. So, for sure. So we got another cue here. Oh, and we've got a hand up.
And we have some support for Rebecca from others who are not fans of the other. You're in good company. Let's see, we have Susie, who would like to ask a question. So I'm gonna click the little allow to talk if you want to join us and ask your question. I am trying to unmute. Technology is not working in our favor. If you can type your question, then I would be happy to read it for you. Unmute is not working, unfortunately.
She might have to unmute herself.
Well, while we wait for, hopefully she'll be able to type her question for us. There's a question about how long we've been doing this work. Rebecca, I think you're one of the longest tenured members of our team. Are you able to share the?
Am I able to remember? I don't. I. This should be an easy question.
So I think the research
started.
started. Oh,
Maya, go ahead.
I was going to jump in and save you. I haven't been here the whole time, but I know the research started back in 2013. But the Ready for K as a product available to organizations across the country, and the company Parent Powered that it's a part of was founded in 2016.
Thank you, Maya and Rebecca.
It was not great.
So we have another question about how many questions should be in a typical survey. David, do you want to give that a shot?
So, yeah, I mean, it really depends on the use case and you know what you're planning on doing with the survey and how much you want to get out of it. But in general, in order to keep family engagement going, in order to keep people into it, I try to limit the surveys that I put out to no more than 5 questions. I find that when people take surveys for longer than 5 to 10 minutes, and I think we all sort of intuitively know this, I'm sure we're all being asked to take surveys from our schools. We tend to get just overwhelmed, and our responses, we start to get less thoughtful as we go through the surveys. We start to get survey fatigue. So if you can, if it's a short enough and a pointed enough survey, then I recommend no more than 5. And another way to consider it is just the amount of time and mental lift. And again, 5 to 10 minutes tops generally works. That said, if this is a survey that covers a far broader purpose, asking people about a year-end survey, asking them to evaluate a program or something far more specific than that, sometimes you really do need to make longer surveys. But I wouldn't ask, I wouldn't be doing a monthly 40, 45, 50 question survey. I think you will find that your response rates tend to fall off rather quickly.
I had a comment and question related to that. Something we didn't talk about is incentives for taking surveys. And I know that that's often a strategy. If you do have more questions you need to ask, how can you incentivize people to complete your survey? What are your thoughts on those, David?
So I've seen it done really well. I've seen it done really poorly. I think, you have to be very careful about how you incentivize people to take a survey, and, what you're doing with them. I've seen people incentivize specific types of responses and use incentives to get specific types of people to take surveys and not others. So that can be a little, it sort of violates every principle of trying to get at the information. So I think, as long as you are careful and you are, incentivizing for all, come take the survey, please do. Another thing that you can do is just not necessarily incentivize, but try to remove barriers. So one of the barriers for people not taking surveys is access to technology. We do a tremendous amount of stuff online. So, can you print out paper surveys and make them available and send them home if people don't have the technology at home? So I tend to think of it as, rather than incentivizing participation, perhaps it's just really a question of access, and can we stop privileging access, and that tends to improve response rates.
One thing that would be, I think, helpful just to note is, I know that in the past at schools that you've worked at, there's been a question about how do we incentivize, and being very careful about making sure that you're not accidentally using funding in a way that is not how it's intended to be used. And this is something that has come up where people have said, can we use this pot of funding to incentivize participation? And so I just want to highlight that that's something people have to be very careful about as well.
Yeah, particularly federal funding pots or state funding pots, but yes, absolutely.
So we are at the top of the hour, and we want to thank Rebecca, Maya, David for jumping in with us today. It's been some really good and interesting questions. As promised, we will be sharing this webinar with everybody who registered. We'll also be posting on our social streams and on our blog, so you will absolutely be able to come back anytime and access the information. And if you have any other questions, then always feel free to reach out to us at the email address on the screen, info@readyfork.com. And thank you to everybody who joined us today.